Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Chike did not set out to replace memory with a person. He only wanted the house to stop sounding like grief. For 2 years after Nkem's death, the laughter in his 3-bedroom duplex was a ghost that Amara tried to chase by humming lullabies to herself, sitting cross-legged on the tiled corridor and tracing the cracks like rivers that might lead her mother home. On Sundays, when the church choir swelled, the 6-year-old would press her small palm against her father's trouser and look up for the "yes, I'm here" signal in his eyes. He always gave it. But he also came home to a kitchen that smelled of disinfectant instead of pepper soup, to a bedroom ordered like a hotel, to a silence that felt respectful, yes, but also like a lock that wouldn't learn his key. When he met Vivian at a cousin's naming ceremony, sleek Gelly tilted like a crown, soft-spoken, sweet with nieces, the possibility of sound returned to him. Not noise, but music arranged into days. Vivian listened as he spoke of Amara's nightmares, and the way he kept forgetting to thaw fish before work, laughed at herself for burning jollof as a teenager, and promised, in the gentle way of people who have survived scarcity, that a home can be built from small intentional mercies. The first night she visited, she noticed the photograph of Nkem on the console, and rather than shift it aside, dusted the frame with the edge of her scarf, whispering she was beautiful, and the words fit the house like a blessing. People said he was moving fast when he proposed months later, but grief does not obey calendars. It obeys warmth. He saw in Vivian not a replacement but a steward of tenderness, someone who, in her own words, understands how to guard a man's peace. It helped that Amara held out her trust like a cautious bird willing to land on a still hand. The first afternoon the three of them baked together. Vivian tied a child-sized apron around Amara's waist and taught her to crack an egg with the confidence of a magician revealing a harmless trick. Flour dusted the child's cheeks, laughter, real laughter, spilled and skittered across the countertops. When the new wife tucked Amara in, she did not steal Nkem's lullaby. She made one of her own, a hushed, rhythmic story about a moon that turned into a silver canoe and ferried little girls through safe dreams. At breakfast, she sat beside father and daughter and asked Amara about school without condescension, nodding at stories of picture books and playground triumphs, as if these were boardroom wins. She replaced the hospital white curtains in the sitting room with soft cream drapes that glowed at dusk. She learned the security guard's mother's name. She left sticky notes on the fridge: drink water, smile at 2 p.m., kiss your daughter good night, even when she was there to ensure they happened. Chike, who had been living like a man trying not to disturb a museum, began to exist again. He started taking shirts to the tailor because Vivian said, "Let the fabric learn your joy." He found himself humming in traffic, making detours to pick up suya because Amara likes the onions extra. The neighbors who had watched the widower's caution nodded to themselves. Perhaps this is how mercy returns. The wedding was intimate, soft with the scent of yellow roses and the insistence of drums that understood restraint. Emeka, his elder brother, lifted him in a bear hug that said both "I'm proud" and "I'm watching," and their mother's sister, Mama Obi, dabbed her eyes with a corner of her wrapper, muttering that God restores locust years. Vivian's vows were precise: no theatrics, no fireworks, just the architecture of a promise. To be safe company for his heart, to keep their home honest, to love the child who did not share her blood as if her blood had been waiting for her. After the reception, when the last guest's laughter faded and the compound settled into the thoughtful hush of a new chapter, the couple walked barefoot across the living room, the tiled coldness reminding them that comfort is a built thing. "This house will hear joy," Vivian whispered, pressing her cheek to his shoulder. Upstairs, Amara slept with a faint smile, clutching the moon canoe story like a talisman. In the weeks that followed, small efficiencies and pleasures multiplied. Meal plans that actually happened, a family calendar marked with playdates and staff birthdays, Saturday mornings spent on the balcony, where Vivian introduced father and daughter to the ritual of morning sun on skin. If the house could speak, it would have said, "Look, I am learning to be a home again." And if Chike could have bottled that opening month, he would have called it proof that second chances sometimes carry first love's gentleness, just arranged differently, as if the heart had been given a new map that still led to belonging. The first wall did not look like a wall. It looked like care. "Babe, I love how close you and Emeka are," Vivian said one evening while setting plates of okra soup and warm EBA on the table. "But I notice how tense you get after he visits. He reminds you of Nkem a lot, doesn't he?" The question wore tenderness like perfume, but it smuggled a suggestion. Pain comes through certain doors. Close them. Chike blinked, surprised at how precisely she had named something he had not articulated. Emeka's affection had always been blunt, older brother love, that arrived like a knock you couldn't ignore. During mourning, it had been ballast. Now, in the soft recalibration of remarriage, his check-ins sometimes felt like audits. "Maybe a little," Chike admitted, and Vivian's hand found his. "Then let's protect what we're building," she murmured, not forbidding, simply proposing a boundary. 2 days later, when Emeka stopped by unannounced with roast corn and the good gossip from the spare parts market, the gate man hesitated before opening because Madam said Oga was resting. Inside, Chike was indeed napping. Outside is seed-learned soil. Emeka laughed it off, but he stared a second too long at the newly printed "No soliciting, no hawking" sign on the gate, a rule that felt sensible and yet, somehow, pointed. He shook his head. New wives, new systems. Give it time. Vivian, for her part, did not sever ties. She braided them, then pulled. When neighbors waved over the fence to ask if the family might attend little Kosi's birthday, she smiled with an apology loaded with kindness. "We'd love to, but Amara is adjusting to a new routine. Please don't be offended." She sent a gift, packaged beautifully, and the refusal traveled wearing respectability. When the Estate Women's Association nominated her for welfare secretary, she laughed hand to chest. "I'm honored, but I need to focus on my home this season." She reinforced the narrative of priority, so well that even those turned away felt seen. Inside, she rearranged the living room in the language of efficiency. Chairs shifted so conversations naturally funneled toward the couple. The console cleared of family knickknacks to reduce dust. The guest bathroom stocked with hotel-sized lotions that said "We are prepared for visitors," even as visits organically dwindled. When Amara asked why Auntie Ada from next door didn't come for cartoons anymore, Vivian cupped the child's cheek and said, "People are busy, my love, and they carry germs we don't need." The comment arrived with a giggle and hand sanitizer. Later that week, when the neighbor sent a tray of fresh vegetables, Vivian called across the fence, "Thank you, sis. You're too kind." But the tray sat on the kitchen counter until the scent of wilt suggested indifference. "We already had more than enough," she told Mom and Ketchy, who quietly wondered since when gratitude expired with the greens. Money, too, began to move in ways that felt like tidying up. Vivian proposed a joint account for clarity, a household budget tracked in a neat spreadsheet, and an updated payroll for staff with formal job descriptions. She brought in a cleaning supply labeled Industrial Descaler and explained, with a smile, that she was done with the stubborn rings in the downstairs toilet. She was competent, organized, and persuasive. Every change could be defended with adult vocabulary. And yet, in the seams between reasons, something cramped. Emeka's calls began to land in hours when Chike was driving, missed, then returned, then shortened. When Big Brother asked if he could take Amara to the zoo on Saturday, Vivian clapped with delight. "What a lovely idea! But she has a school recital rehearsal. Next time." Next time found a conflict. The conflicts multiplied until intent looked like inconvenience. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Chike reviewed invoices in his office, Vivian texted, "Do you ever feel like your family doesn't really respect your boundaries?" He stared at the glow of his phone. Boundaries. A good word. A necessary word. He typed, "Sometimes." She replied, "We'll keep our peace. That's our wealth." It was a beautiful sentence, the kind that can hide a gate behind its poetry. Outside the compound, the world continued. Inside, voices lowered. Footsteps learned caution. Friendship arrived less. The house was still warm, but a draft snuck under the door, and if you held your ear to the wall, you could hear mortar drying where there had once been nothing between hearts but air. It happened on a Sunday after Jollof, the kind of afternoon that should have buckled under laughter and naps. Emeka came with his wife, Chioma, and their toddlers, the twins already sticky with mango. He brought the roast corn that used to be code for, "I didn't come empty-handed, so you can't accuse me of supervising." In the sitting room, the football match murmured on low volume. Toddlers built cities from throw pillows, and Amara sat close to Uncle Emeka. In that posture children reserve for adults who make the world feel both big and navigable. Vivian emerged from the kitchen with a tray, Zobo sweating in glass tumblers, and for a while everything looked like family. Then Chioma, eager and thoughtless in the way of people too happy to sense edges, clapped lightly and exclaimed, "Vivian, this house has changed, oh. It's shining. You tried. Our brother likes enjoyment." The compliment was a ribbon tossed into a breeze. Vivian caught it and smiled. "We're just keeping things simple," she said. Emeka, perhaps remembering the gate hesitations, chuckled. "Simple. But these days we have to book appointment to see our brother." He meant it as a tease, a pinprick to release pressure. The room did not read it that way. Vivian's smile went taut, like fabric pulled too hard. "Appointment," she repeated, soft. "Because I asked the gate man to check if my husband was sleeping." Emeka raised both hands in surrender. "Sister, I day play. No vex. But wounded people, or people invested in the performance of injury, hear only echo. This is what I mean," she continued. Voice still gentle enough to confuse. A woman tries to keep her home calm, and suddenly she is controlling. Gold digger, gatekeeper, all the names, because what? Because you are his elder. Silence wobbled. The toddlers paused in their chaos, responding to the electricity adults pretend children cannot taste. Chioma leaned forward, eyes wide as if to signal, "Let it go." But Emeka is a man who has carried a brother through storms. He hates the smell of accusation. "No one called you gold digger," he said, even though once an uncle had muttered it in a corridor and he had slapped the word from the air. "We are happy Chike found love again." But family cannot be turned away with smiles. Today is Sunday. We do not need appointment to see our blood. Vivian placed the tray on the center table, like a judge setting down a file. "And a wife is not blood?" she asked. "A wife who cooks, who keeps, who sings to the child you dropped gifts for, and then go. A wife who bleached the bathroom tiles until her fingers ached, so that you can sit here and call her gatekeeper." Chike, who had been rubbing Amara's shoulder absent-mindedly, felt the heat rise in his neck, the old panic of conflict he had not sanctioned. He stood, palm out. "Please," he said, voice level, the peacemaker reflex. "We're family. Emeka, you know how I've been trying to rest my head. Viv only wants calm." It should have ended there, with a shrug and a new story about football. But pride loves an audience. Emeka laughed, short and disbelieving. "Rest your head." He glanced at the "no soliciting" sign visible from the open window. "From who? Us? Since when did our mother's children become noise?" Amara pressed closer into her father's side. The twins resumed their tumbling, unaware they were cushioning a fall, without knowing whose. Vivian's eyes glistened, and tears, real or rehearsed, banked at their rims. "You see," she whispered to Chike. "You see how I am spoken to in this house?" Chioma reached for her hand. Vivian did not take it. At the doorway, Mama Nkechi hovered, conflict's witness, like household staff have always been, praying to become furniture. Chike moved, as men move who fear being forced to choose, toward the nearest exit from shame. He turned to his brother. "Nah, let's not make a scene," he said, using the old tenderness. But his tone tilted toward his wife. "Please respect my home." The phrase was a key in the wrong lock. Emeka stiffened, then stood slowly, the clink of his glass on the table, a tiny bell tolling something official. He looked at his brother with the weariness of a man watching a road collapse, exactly where he had predicted it would, but hoped it wouldn't. "Respect," he said, soft now. "I have always respected you. But I will not audition for you." He gathered his toddlers, apologized to Chioma with his eyes, and nodded at Amara with a smile meant to outlast discomfort. At the door he added, not unkindly, "My line is open, Chike. Call me when you tire of quiet." When the gate clicked shut, Vivian exhaled as if a ghost had been exorcised and then began to cry in earnest. falling into Chike's arms with the practiced surrender of someone who knows the choreography of sympathy. "You saw," she murmured. "You saw how he spoke to me." Chike, neck hot, chest tight, said the sentence that would echo later like regret. "I'm sorry, my love. It won't happen again." And as he said it, the house learned something new. It learned how to trade one kind of peace for another that looked like consent, but was actually the first brick in a wall. The compound had once been a revolving door of greetings, children leaning on the gate to call for Amara to come and play, women from the next street dropping by to share bowls of steaming okra, and men from the neighborhood stopping in to say hello to Chike over a quick beer. But within months of Vivian's arrival, the gate's hinges began to squeak from disuse. It started with small interactions, the kind that don't make headlines but change the temperature of a place. Mrs. Ebra from 2 houses down came one Saturday morning with a tray of fresh ugu from her garden. She found Vivian sweeping the front porch in a fitted house dress and bright scarf. "Ah, Vivian, good morning. Oh, I brought some leaves, very fresh," Mrs. Ebra began, her voice light. Vivian looked up, broom still in hand, her smile tight, not reaching her eyes. "Thank you, but we buy our vegetables from ShopRite. These ones might have sand," she said, her tone polite but sharp enough to slice the air. Mrs. Ebra's smile faltered. She set the tray down anyway and left with a short wave. The leaves sat on the kitchen counter until they wilted into a smell that made Mama Nkechi wrinkle her nose. When she asked why they hadn't been cooked, Vivian simply said, "We can't eat what we didn't pay for. People always want to count favors." Word spread faster than wind in that estate. The woman who sold Puff Puff at the corner was ignored when she called out "Good afternoon" one hot day. The young men who once volunteered to help trim the hedges stopped coming, saying, "That new madam doesn't like people touching her things." Even the gateman, who had been there since Chike's Weddington Chem, learned to keep his greetings brief unless he wanted to see Vivian's face tighten like a rope being pulled. When neighbors did try to visit, Vivian had perfected her manner, warm enough to avoid outright offense, but laced with a coolness that made them feel like intruders. "Oh, what a lovely surprise," she'd say, stepping outside instead of inviting them in. "But we're just sitting down for a private family talk. Maybe another day." Another day never came. By the end of that year, the once lively house had become a place where even delivery men left packages at the gate instead of knocking. Amara began to notice the change. "Why doesn't Kosi come play anymore?" she asked one evening. Her small face crinkled in confusion. Vivian brushed it off. "People are busy, my dear. And you don't need too many friends, just your family." Inside, the silence grew heavier. For Chike, it was subtle at first. He told himself that the absence of visitors meant more privacy, more time to focus on his family. Vivian reinforced this idea often, draping herself against him in the evenings and saying things like, "It's good we're not distracted by outsiders. Outsiders bring trouble." He nodded along, believing the words, until even the sound of the gate creaking open for someone familiar began to feel strange. Mom Nkechi, however, noticed everything. She saw the way Amara lingered at the fence during the afternoons, watching other children pass, hoping someone would wave. She saw the way Vivian's eyes hardened whenever a neighbor's voice floated over the compound wall. But the maid kept quiet. She knew speaking up would only put her in the crosshairs of a woman who knew how to remove people from the picture without anyone suspecting her. When Chike was away for work, sometimes 2, 3 nights at a time, the house shifted its shape. Vivian's soft smiles hardened into thin lines. Her voice took on an edge that no one outside those walls had heard, and the little kindnesses she performed in Chike's presence evaporated. Amara became the center of her irritation, not because the child had done anything wrong, but because she existed as a reminder that Vivian was not the first woman to shape Chike's life. The punishments started small, being told to redo chores for doing them lazily, having her food portion so small she went to bed hungry, or being told to stand for hours in the corridor as discipline. Mom Nkechi would sneak her a banana or a slice of bread when Vivian wasn't looking, whispering, "Just hold on, your papa will be back soon." But the cruelty escalated. One rainy afternoon, Amara accidentally spilled water on the dining table while pouring herself a cup. Vivian's reaction was sharp, as though she'd been waiting for the smallest mistake. "Are you an animal? Can't you use your eyes?" she hissed, dragging the girl by her arm toward the kitchen. She made Amara scrub the entire floor with a rag, no mop, until her small hands were raw. Later that night, when Chike called from his hotel to say goodnight, Vivian stood beside Amara as she spoke, smiling sweetly and prompting her. "Tell Daddy you're fine. Tell him you're happy." The child obeyed, her voice steady but her eyes wet. After the call, Vivian leaned down, her tone low and menacing. "If you make him worry about nonsense, you'll scrub the whole compound next time." Mama Nkechi's chest ached watching it happen, but she was trapped. The last maid who had confronted Vivian about her temper had been fired on the spot, accused of stealing jewelry. Mama Nkechi knew better than to challenge her outright. She needed her job, but she also needed to protect Amara in the small way she could. When she heard Amara crying quietly in her room, she'd sit on the edge of the bed and hum a song Kem used to sing, letting the sound fill the darkness. Sometimes she thought of calling Chike, but she'd seen how deeply Vivian had woven herself into his trust. Without proof, she'd only make herself an enemy. The cruelty stayed hidden, wrapped in the polite smile Vivian wore like armor when Chike returned. Vivian's manipulation extended beyond the walls of their home, reshaping the way Chike interacted with the world. Friends who used to drop by unannounced stopped showing up entirely. At first, Chike assumed it was just life. People were busy, after all. But he began to notice a pattern. When he mentioned an old friend in conversation, Vivian would tilt her head, feigning concern, and say, "Oh, you didn't hear what they've been saying about you." She would plant just enough doubt to make him second-guess calling them. "You know, people envy happiness," she'd add, squeezing his hand like a comforter delivering bad news. Chike, not wanting to believe his friends could be so petty, quietly pulled back from them. By mid-year, invitations to parties, weddings, and reunions had dwindled. Vivian explained it away. "It's better this way. Less drama, more focus on your business and family." But Chike's business was beginning to show cracks. Clients complained about delayed responses, small debts piled up because household expenses kept increasing, and he felt a fatigue he couldn't explain. Vivian's spending habits were lavish and relentless. New designer clothes, weekly salon visits, expensive perfumes. Whenever he questioned her, she'd become defensive. "Do you want your wife to look like she's suffering? People will think you can't take care of me." The conversation would end with her in tears and him apologizing for even bringing it up. Meanwhile, Vivian was living a second life when he wasn't home. Mama Nkechi had caught glimpses. Young men visiting while Chike was away, staying just long enough to leave a faint cologne trail in the hallway. Sometimes, Vivian would disappear for hours, returning in a new outfit, humming to herself as if she had spent the afternoon in harmless leisure. But the most alarming thing for Mom Nkechi was that the house had lost all warmth from the outside world. Even the mailman began to drop letters at the gate without stepping in. Amara stopped expecting friends, stopped asking why no one visited, and began to play alone in the garden, drawing in the dirt with a stick. To anyone looking in from outside, the family seemed private and happy. But inside, the silence was heavy, the walls close, and the life Chike thought he was building was slowly being hollowed out, one absence at a time. The money did not vanish in a single dramatic gulp. It leaked, thin, persistent, almost polite, until the floorboards of Chike's life were soft with damp. It began with a designer handbag that Vivian insisted was an investment piece, a limited release that could be resold at a profit if they ever needed cash. Chike laughed at her confidence and approved the transfer because what was love if not margin for someone else's taste? Then came the salon memberships, plural, because one place never gets color and conditioning right at the same time, and the wardrobe refresh that, in her words, would represent the family well. The justification was a warm, agile thing. When Chike winced, Vivian would loop her arms around his waist and whisper that image was armor in this city where people measure a man by the care he give his wife. The spreadsheet she had built to make life easier acquired new tabs: lifestyle, home upgrades, wellness, each tab carrying numbers that looked reasonable in isolation. But isolation is how lies rehearse their sanity. When utility bills arrived late one month, Vivian gasped at the incompetence of the distribution company and paid double to teach the emergency. When the generator sputtered, she replaced not the faulty part but the entire unit because dependability cannot be negotiated. Each decision could stand up in court, the defense eloquent. Comfort, efficiency, dignity. Yet the week he logged into their joint account and felt his breath hitch at the dwindled cushion. No courtroom could calm that instinctive animal inside him that knew the earth had shifted beneath his feet. Debt collectors have many voices, but the most dangerous is the friendly one. A man named Kola began calling, his tone both apologetic and insistent, informing Chike about a lingering balance on the credit card that Vivian had requested for emergencies. Chike frowned, relayed the information at dinner, and watched Vivian act surprised with the finesse of a stage professional. Hand to chest, brows knitting, a rush to fetch her handbag and shuffle receipts. "I swear I paid it," she said, sliding crisp slips across the table like proof of innocence. The dates were there, the numbers were mitigated. Somehow the total remained unforgiving. When Chike suggested consolidating accounts and freezing new purchases until they caught up, Vivian's eyes filled with glassy tears that seemed to accuse him of smallness. "Do you want your wife to look like a beggar? After everything I've done to keep this home shining?" He backpedaled, made the classic mistake of comforting the person whose actions required accountability, and promised to find a way. The way, in the immediate term, looked like an overdraft and a quiet cash withdrawal from his business reserve, just to cover this month's gap. Meanwhile, the estate association fees were increased, the school PTA announced a development levy, and a client delayed payment on a contract that had required supplier deposits. Pressure layered itself like humidity. There was no breeze. It was Mom and Ketchy who noticed the strange texture of the new, industrial-grade cleaning products lined along the store shelf, bottles with hazard triangles and small print warnings that began with avoid contact. She had never seen such things in a household. She handled them like sleeping snakes and tucked the most alarming one, the descaling acid, behind the less menacing detergents, telling herself that caution is a type of prayer. On payday, she overheard Vivian on the phone with a boutique owner, negotiating a pair of shoes that even Lagos Island ladies could not get. Later, she emptied the trash and found the boutique's invoice crumpled beneath tissue, an amount that could have fed the staff's families for months. She swallowed her judgment like a bitter seed and kept moving, because salaried people survive by choosing which realities to confront. Through all of it, Amara watched her father's smile grow tired at the edges. He still knelt to tie her shoelaces in the mornings and still bought her roadside boli on Fridays. But his eyes had learned a faraway stare that always meant arithmetic. Once, she asked him if math could choke a person. He laughed and said math only chokes when we try to hide it. Then he kissed her forehead and returned to his laptop, where the sums refused to forgive. Vivian, sensing the wobble, doubled down on spectacle. New curtains that draped like soft waterfalls, crystal bowls that caught the light at noon. A dinner set so fine he was afraid to breathe near it. "Isn't home supposed to feel like a dream?" she asked, and he nodded. Even his dreams began to build interest. Infidelity did not march into the house in a red dress. It arrived in the scent of a cologne that did not belong to Chike, a brightness to Vivian's laughter reserved for phone calls taken in doorways, a pair of scuffed sneakers that appeared by the back entrance and vanished before dawn. The first night Mama and Ketchy saw him, he was a slim, smooth-cheeked boy man with a barber-fresh fade and the restless confidence of someone who had learned how older women love to be reassured they were immortal. He called himself Tiga and greeted the maid with a grin too wide for courtesy. "Auntie, good evening," he said, as if he lived there. Vivian's voice floated in from the sitting room casual. "Nkechi, you can go and sleep. I'll lock up." That sentence, when spoken by a woman who buys locks for people, is an eviction. The maid retreated to her small room off the corridor and sat on the edge of her bed, listening to laughter lace the air like silk ribbon tugged playfully, then a door closing, then the long, familiar silence of houses where truth decides to step outside for fresh air. In the morning, she found the crystal fruit bowl nicked at the rim and a faint smear of lipstick on a glass that did not belong to any known shade in the house. Vivian's eyes held warning when their glances met, an unblinking stare that said, Remember who signs the salary. Tiga was not the only one. There were others whose names never became known, fluid appearances that aligned with Chike's travel calendar. Vivian had perfected a system. Deliveries scheduled for afternoons when the street was quiet, rendezvous time for after the gateman's meal breaks, the air freshener in the hallway sprayed in obsessive intervals that suggested hospitality, but were really disinfectant for conscience. At times, she would abandon the house entirely for hours, stepping out in athletic where that announced gym, but returning in clothing that announced another man's hands had been present. Creases that shirts do not make alone, a loose curl of hair at her nape that no treadmill can rearrange. Her arrogance grew in proportion to isolation. There was no neighbor to witness, no brother-in-law to drop by, no friend to call unannounced. The estate security learned her tone and learned to love their jobs. When a guard once joked, "Madam, we saw your sister last night," she tilted her head and asked him to repeat himself. He didn't. 2 weeks later, he was replaced by someone quieter. Chike felt what good men often feel in such moments. A suspicion that acted like a stray dog. It circled, it sniffed, it refused to leave, and yet it could be shooed for a day with a soft lie. He returned from a trip to Port Harcourt early one Friday because the meeting ended ahead of schedule, and because he wanted to surprise his wife with suya and his daughter with a coloring book. Traffic blessed his spontaneity. When he turned his key, the sitting room was dim except for the low blue light of the TV. No chatter, no footsteps. He set the suya on the dining table and moved through air that felt recently rearranged. In the hallway, a scent coiled up into his throat, synthetic sweetness with a harsher note beneath, like fruit layered over metal. Vivian emerged from the guest room wearing his old t-shirt and a lilt to her smile. "Babe, you're back," she sang, wrapping herself around him before his senses found their edges. He broadened his grin to match hers, because this is how marriages live past 8 p.m. You choose the story you can sleep beside. He kissed her, and when she pulled away, he noticed her lipstick was new. "Where's Amara?" he asked. "Sleeping," she said, too fast, and then dragged him toward their room with enthusiasm that wanted to erase a timeline. Later, eyes on the ceiling fan blades, he asked about the guest room. She said she had been sorting clothes for donation. He nodded. The stray dog of suspicion lay down at his feet and stared. Children speak, in weather reports, when adults refuse to hear language. The first storm alert appeared in Amara's drawings. Crayon figures cramped into the corner of pages, a little girl with big eyes standing beside a smaller shape labeled Moon, and near them, a larger figure whose smile was exaggerated, whose hand hovered above the child's head holding a rectangle scribbled in angry brown. Her class teacher, Miss Beasy, noticed a shift from the sunny gardens and stick figure families of earlier terms to these hurried, claustrophobic vignettes. During creative writing, when asked to tell a story about your favorite sound, Amara wrote about the hush that comes after shouting stops. Miss Beasy called her to the side after school, crouched to make their eyes level, and asked the kind of question that can open a river. "How is home, my darling?" The girl glanced at the doorway where the school security guard stood with a ledger, then at the wall clock whose second hand stuttered. "Home is quiet," she said carefully, and added, "Quiet can be big." The teacher nodded, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Protocol demanded discretion. Compassion demanded more. She asked Amara to draw her family. The child drew her father with a square chest and a smile, herself with a small son above her head, and Vivian with a huge mouth and a bottle in her right hand, a bottle that looked like a potion from a storybook, labeled with 3 angry triangles that even a 6-year-old knows mean danger. That afternoon, Miss Beasy called the number listed as secondary guardian, which belonged to Vivian. The conversation was honeyed and invasive at once. When the teacher explained her concern, Vivian laughed softly. "You know children," she cooed. "They see cartoons and bring witches to school." She thanked the teacher profusely for her care, promised to talk to Amara about drawing happy things, and requested that such sensitive matters be shared with her alone, because Chike is very busy and still grieving his late wife. These things make him sad. Before hanging up, she complimented the teacher's scarf. "So elegant on you," and somehow managed to make the call feel like a favor granted. The next morning, She arrived at school with cupcakes for the class and a plastic smile for the staff. "We appreciate you," she said, and the staff room's atmosphere softened because sugar is an easy gospel. Miss Beasy watched the pageantry with a clenched jaw and wrote a note to herself. Observe. Document. If patterns persist, escalate to the school counselor. She folded the note into her diary like a seed under soil. At home, patterns did not merely persist, they hardened. Vivian moved Amara's bedtime earlier and earlier, not for rest, but for control. "Children need structure," she declared, which in her mouth meant silence on schedule. She restricted the girls' snacks under the banner of wellness, but served herself midnight bowls of ice cream that melted on the coffee table, while she scrolled through her phone and smiled at messages that lit her face from within. On nights when the child whimpered from the ache behind her knees, growing pains, or the ache of standing too long in punishment, Vivian issued shushing sounds that sounded like affection but carried no mercy. When Chike called from yet another overnight trip and asked, "How's my baby?" Amara answered in a careful voice she had learned, "I am fine, Daddy." After the call, she once whispered to her pillow, "I am fine again," as if practicing fluency in a foreign tongue. The only place she told the truth was inside pictures. She drew a kitchen where the floor swam like a silver river, and above it, a bottle with tiny excess raining down. She drew herself wearing a helmet like a knight, a shield labeled Daddy, and a big hand trying to yank the shield away. She folded the page and slid it under her mattress, because even paper prefers darkness to disbelief. The house, once a place relearning joy, had become a museum of performances. Wife as curator, husband as donor, child as vulnerable exhibit, maid as silent guard. And in the storeroom behind the cleaning supplies, behind a bottle with a hazard triangle that smiled like a dare, a future was waiting, patient as venom. Chike had always been a man who believed in hard work as a cure-all, the sort of man who thought late nights at the office and early mornings with his laptop were acts of love because they paid for school fees, kept the fridge full, and maintained a roof over his child's head. But lately, work had stopped rewarding him. Payments from clients dragged on for weeks, sometimes months. His suppliers, who once gave him generous credit lines, began insisting on cash up front. More troubling was the constant pressure at home. Vivian's shopping trips, her taste for imported wines, her insistence on hosting private dinners that cost more than an entire week's groceries. Each time he hinted that they should slow down, she found a way to make him feel guilty, accusing him of wanting her to live like a widow, or suggesting that his late wife's memory still held more value in his heart than she did. The accusations landed like invisible weights, making him too weary to argue. By mid-year, his savings account was a shadow of what it once was. The emergency fund he had guarded since Amara's birth had been rated to cover unexpected expenses. A new sofa set because the old one looked too ordinary. A luxury weekend getaway because we need to bond as a couple. And even a private driver she hired without telling him, justifying it as security. The cracks began to show in his demeanor. He was shorter with his employees. His laughter at work had all but disappeared, and he had taken to rubbing the bridge of his nose during meetings, as if he could massage away the numbers that no longer added up. His phone vibrated more with calls from banks than with contracts. At home, the atmosphere was no balm. Amara, sensitive to her father's moods, began to greet him with hesitant smiles, unsure if her joy might be too loud for his tired spirit. Vivian, however, maintained her perfectionist grip on the house's appearance. Fresh flowers in the hallway, glossy floors, curtains laundered weekly. To outsiders, they still looked like a thriving, well-kept family. But inside, the man who had once been the house's heartbeat was starting to feel like a ghost in his own home, present, yet fading. Nights found him staring at the ceiling, calculating debts and trying to recall when exactly the balance between providing for his family and preserving himself had shifted beyond his control. It was at the annual community fundraiser that the facade began to slip in public. Chike arrived with Vivian on his arm, her gown a shimmering emerald that caught every camera flash, her perfume a floral mist that announced her presence before she spoke. He had hoped the evening would be a break from the tension at home, a chance to mingle with business contacts, and perhaps rekindle some goodwill among neighbors. For the first hour, it seemed possible. Polite conversation, light laughter, the occasional proud glance at his wife's elegance. But then he noticed her drifting, first to the drinks table, then to a circle of younger men, one of whom he recognized vaguely as the son of a real estate developer. The young man leaned in close as Vivian laughed, her hand brushing his sleeve in a gesture far too familiar for a married woman at her husband's side. Whispers began to stir. A couple of Chike's acquaintances exchanged knowing looks, and one, a man he had gone to university with, approached to murmur, "My guy, control your woman before people start talking too much." The comment, though meant as a warning, landed like a slap. Chike watched Vivian tilt her head at something the young man said, her smile lingering in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. When she finally returned to his side, he asked, under his breath, "Do you think that's appropriate?" She feigned innocence instantly, eyes widening. "What? I was networking. Or do you not want your wife to make connections?" The challenge in her tone dared him to push further, but he knew how that script ended, with her in tears, accusing him of jealousy, and him apologizing to restore peace. Still, the damage was done. The rest of the evening felt like a performance he could no longer fully commit to. On the drive home, he kept his eyes on the road, hands tight on the steering wheel. Vivian filled the silence with small talk about who wore what and which families were losing their touch. Chike gave monosyllabic replies, his mind replaying the glances exchanged by those who had witnessed her flirtations. He thought about the years he had spent building his name in the community, the trust he had earned, and how quickly one person's actions could erode it. Vivian, sensing his coldness, leaned back and scrolled through her phone, unconcerned. By the time they pulled into the driveway, he had already decided that if his home could not offer him respect, then at the very least it should offer him truth. What he didn't yet realize was that truth was about to arrive in a form that would scorch everything it touched. The day it happened, the sky was heavy with the kind of clouds that promise a storm but make you wait for it. Vivian had returned from a tense meeting with one of her lovers, though, of course, Chike didn't know the details, and her mood was volcanic. She slammed doors, barked instructions at Mom and Ketchy, and walked through the house with a restlessness that made even the air seem nervous. Amara, who had been quietly coloring at the dining table, accidentally knocked over her cup of juice, the liquid seeping toward the edge. Vivian's head snapped around, her eyes narrowing. "Useless child," she spat, yanking the girl by the arm. "Do you know how much this tablecloth cost?" Amara stammered an apology, tears already forming, but it only seemed to feed the older woman's fury. Instead of a simple reprimand, Vivian's rage sought spectacle. She dragged Amara into the kitchen, muttering about teaching her a lesson she'll never forget. From a storage shelf, she pulled down a bottle of industrial descaling acid, the same one Mom and Ketchy had always kept hidden at the back. The maid, realizing what was about to happen, froze for a split second before stepping forward. "Madam, no," she pleaded, but Vivian turned on her with a glare that rooted her to the spot. "Stay out of this, unless you want me to teach you too," she hissed. She gripped the bottle tighter, unscrewing the cap slowly, almost savoring the moment. Amara whimpered, her small hands covering her face. It was at that exact moment that the front door opened. Chike, home earlier than expected from a canceled meeting, stepped inside and immediately caught the sound of his daughter's sobs. He moved quickly toward the kitchen, calling out, "Amara." What he saw when he entered stopped his heart cold. Vivian, towering over their child, the open bottle poised above her head, her face twisted in a snarl he had never seen before. Instinct took over. He lunged forward, knocking the bottle from her hand. It clattered to the floor, spilling a small puddle that hissed against the tiles. The sharp, chemical smell rose instantly, stinging his nostrils. He pulled Amara into his arms, shielding her with his body. Vivian, caught in the act, didn't flinch into remorse. Instead, she straightened, her expression shifting almost instantly into one of feigned horror. "Oh my God, Chike, thank God you came." She was about to drink it. "I was trying to stop her." The lie was so shameless it stunned him into silence for a heartbeat. But then he looked at Amara's terrified face, at the way she clung to him, and something in him hardened in a way that would never soften again. For a long, breathless second, the kitchen was nothing but soundless stares. Vivian's eyes darting between Chike's furious glare and the trembling child in his arms, the sharp scent of acid biting into the air. Chike's heart was thundering, so loud it almost drowned out everything else. She was about to drink it, he repeated slowly, each word weighted like an anvil. Vivian clasped her hands together, stepping forward with a rehearsed urgency. Yes. I came in and saw her playing with the bottle. You know how children are. I grabbed it before she hurt herself. Her tone was carefully pitched, a performance for an audience she could no longer charm. But the tremor in her left hand betrayed her. Chike's gaze shifted to the kitchen floor, to the puddle of acid sizzling faintly against the tiles, then to Mama Nkechi frozen in the doorway, her face pale with a mixture of fear and fury. Mama Nkechi, Chike said, his voice low but edged with steel. What happened here? The maid's mouth opened, then closed. For months she had swallowed truths to keep her job, to avoid confrontation, but the sight of that bottle in Vivian's hand, aimed at a child who had done nothing but exist, snapped something in her. Olga, she was going to pour it on Amara, she said, her voice trembling but steadying as the words found their rhythm. I saw her. She shouted at the child, called her useless, and went for the acid. This is not the first time she has been wicked to her. She beats her, makes her kneel for hours, starves her when you are not here. I've been keeping quiet, but this one was too much. Vivian spun toward her, eyes blazing. Liar. You're just jealous because I am your madam. You've always wanted to turn my husband against me. But Chike wasn't looking at her anymore. His attention was fixed on his daughter, who was still clinging to his shirt, her small body shaking. Amara, he said softly, tell Daddy the truth. Were you playing with the bottle? The child shook her head without hesitation, tears streaking her face. She was angry because I spilled juice, she whispered. She said I would never forget today. That was all it took. The truth was not a thunderclap. It was a quiet, shattering rain that washed away the last of Chike's denial. In that moment, he knew the woman he had trusted with his home was not just flawed or difficult. She was dangerous. Vivian's pivot from denial to manipulation was swift. She stepped toward Chike, lowering her voice to a tone that had once melted his anger. Babe, I know how this looks, but you can't just believe them over me. You're my husband. You know I love Amara. She's like my own child. Chike said nothing, his jaw tight. She reached for his arm, but he pulled it back. Don't touch me, he said, the words low but cutting. For the first time since he had known her, Vivian's mask faltered. Her lips parted in shock, and for a fleeting moment, the charming, composed woman gave way to something raw, a flash of contempt, almost disgust, before she smoothed it over. She turned her attention to Mama Nkechi instead, her voice rising now. So this is your plan? To poison my husband's mind against me? You think he'll choose you over me? The maid stood her ground. This is not about me, madam. This is about the child. Vivian scoffed, then shifted tactics again, walking over to the cupboard, grabbing a rag, and bending to clean the spilled acid. Fine. Let's not make a drama out of this, she said over her shoulder. We can talk like a family without involving outsiders. It was a desperate attempt to restore control, erase the scene before it could harden into evidence. But Chike wasn't moving toward reconciliation. He picked up his phone and began scrolling with deliberate calm. You're right, he said. We'll talk. But first, I need to check something. Vivian froze, the rag in her hand. Check what? She asked. Chike didn't answer immediately. He was thinking of the small CCTV camera hidden in the living room, installed months earlier after a petty theft. He had almost forgotten it existed. Until now. If you've been telling the truth, the camera will prove it, he said finally, his eyes locking on hers. For the first time that evening, Vivian's composure cracked in a way she couldn't disguise. Her hand stilled on the floor. Chike, you don't need to go digging. Some things should stay in the family. But the words only confirmed his suspicion. Whatever was on that footage, she didn't want him to see. Chike's hands were steady as he retrieved the small external hard drive from the drawer in his home office. Vivian trailed behind him, her voice alternating between pleading and scolding. Babe, listen to me. Those cameras catch things out of context. You'll only upset yourself. You know, people twist things. He ignored her, plugging the drive into his laptop. The playback opened to a list of time-stamped clips. He selected one from 2 weeks ago, around 7 p.m., when he had been away in Abuja. The screen flickered, then filled with the living room. Amara on her knees, scrubbing the floor, Vivian standing over her with a belt in hand. No sound was needed. The raised arm, the flinch, the child's bowed head told the story. Vivian lunged forward, slamming the laptop shut. This is nonsense, she snapped, but her voice was too high, too sharp. Chaik opened it again, scrolling through more clips. Vivian yanking Amara by the hair into the kitchen, shoving her toward the stairs, eating dinner alone at the table while the child sat in the corner without a plate. Mama Nkechi appeared in some frames, offering small gestures of comfort when Vivian's back was turned. Each scene was a nail in the coffin of the image Vivian had built. Chaik felt a deep, cold anger settle into his bones, not the explosive rage that fades, but the kind that waits, measures, and decides. How long? He asked quietly, his voice trembling with restraint. How long have you been doing this to my child? Vivian didn't answer. She stood there, arms folded, her eyes flashing with something between defiance and fear. You've lied to me, Chaik said finally, closing the laptop. You've hurt my daughter. And you nearly, God help me, you nearly scarred her for life tonight. His voice broke on the last words, but his resolve did not. From this moment, everything changes. Vivian tried one last tactic, softening her tone. Babe, don't let them destroy our marriage. We can fix this, for the sake of the child. But Chaik had already reached for his phone, scrolling to a number he had never thought he'd call in his own home. The police. When he spoke, it was, without hesitation. I'd like to report a case of child abuse, he said. Yes, the suspect is my wife. Vivian's face drained of color, and for the first time that night, she looked truly afraid. Chaik stood in the center of a living room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan the only sound between them. Vivian hovered near the staircase, arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes darting between the laptop on the table and the phone in his hand. So that's it, she asked, her voice a blend of disbelief and simmering rage. After everything I've done for this family, you believe a child and a maid over me? Chaik's gaze was steady, his tone controlled in the way of a man who has decided that control is more powerful than shouting. I believe what I saw of Vivian. I believe my daughter's tears. I believe the bruises she tried to hide. And I believe that tonight you were ready to disfigure a 6-year-old because your pride was bruised over a spilled drink. Each word landed like a gavel strike. Vivian's laugh was sharp, brittle. You think you're better than me? You think your precious late wife was a saint? You have no idea how much I've had to endure in this house. Your family never accepted me. Your friends always looked down on me. And your daughter, she broke off, as if realizing too late that the last statement was a confession in itself. Chaik stepped forward, his voice dropping. My daughter is a child. You're supposed to protect her, not make her fear the sound of your footsteps. Vivian's jaw clenched, her defiance faltering under the weight of his words. She opened her mouth, but Chaik raised his hand, cutting her off. Save it. There's nothing you can say now that will change what's about to happen. For a moment, she searched his face for a crack, a hint of the man who once defended her against everyone. But that man was gone, replaced by someone she could not sway. You'll regret this, she said finally, her voice low and venomous. Chaik didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside as 2 uniformed police officers entered through the open door, their expressions impassive. Mrs. Vivian Obi, one of them asked. She froze, then let out a disbelieving scoff. You called the police? For me? Chaik's answer was a simple nod. For what you did to my child. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, one reading out her rights while the other retrieved a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Vivian's voice rose, desperate now. This is madness. Chaik, stop them. We can talk about this, please. She glanced toward the open doorway, where a couple of curious neighbors had gathered, drawn by the sight of a police vehicle parked outside. The irony was bitter. After months of pushing them away, now they stood at her gate, witnesses to her humiliation. Her protests grew louder, shifting from pleas to insults. "You're destroying this family. You're letting them win. This is what your brother wanted all along." The officer holding her arm simply said, "Ma, cooperate." Chaik stood with Amara beside him, one hand on her shoulder. The child clung to him, her wide eyes fixed on the scene, as if trying to understand how someone who had once been called Mummy could now be led away like this. Mama Nkechi stood in the background, silent but resolute, her arms crossed in a gesture that was both protective and triumphant. The officers guided Vivian out of the house, her gown sweeping against the floor in a mockery of grace. At the threshold, she turned back one last time, her gaze locking on Chaik's. "You'll regret this for the rest of your life," she hissed, before being ushered into the waiting vehicle. As the car pulled away, the murmurs from the gate grew louder. Some of the neighbors shook their heads, whispering about karma. Others looked at Chaik with a mix of sympathy and vindication. Emeka, his elder brother, arrived minutes later, having heard from a friend in the estate. His expression was grim, but when he saw Amara safe in Chaik's arms, his shoulders eased. "I told you," he said quietly, "but I'm glad you saw it for yourself before it was too late." Chaik didn't answer immediately. He was watching the disappearing taillights, feeling both the relief of a burden lifted and the heaviness of the wreckage left behind. The days that followed were a blur of legal appointments, statements to the police, and hushed conversations with lawyers. The footage from the CCTV camera became the cornerstone of the case, supplemented by Mama Nkechi's testimony and Amara's quiet but clear recounting of events. Vivian, through her lawyer, tried to spin the narrative, claiming the videos were taken out of context, that Amara had been difficult, and that discipline had been misinterpreted as abuse. But the acid incident was impossible to explain away. The chemical burns it had left on the kitchen tiles told a story as damning as any witness. Chaik filed for divorce within a week of her arrest, the petition citing cruelty, child endangerment, and infidelity. Vivian's initial bravado crumbled when she realized he would not be swayed by pleas or threats. She tried calling him from a holding cell, her voice softer, almost tearful. "Chaik, think about what people will say. Think about Amara growing up without a mother." His reply was cold but unwavering. "She already grew up without one the moment you decided to hurt her." The papers were served the next morning. News of the arrest and impending divorce spread quickly, partly because the neighbors, who had once been kept at a distance, now had a story to tell. Some shook their heads in pity. Others said it was justice. For Chaik, it was neither. It was necessity. He moved forward not out of vengeance, but because he could not allow his daughter to live another day in fear. At night, when the house was quiet, he would sit on the edge of Amara's bed, watching her sleep. Each steady breath reminded him that no matter how much Vivian had cost him, in money, reputation, and peace, protecting his child was a debt he would never regret paying. The house felt different without Vivian's presence, not empty, but lighter, as if the walls themselves could finally exhale. Sunlight streamed through the windows without the weight of judgment, and the garden, once neglected, became a small sanctuary where Amara could play freely again. Chaik devoted himself to being home more, canceling unnecessary trips and restructuring his business so that it didn't keep him away for days at a time. The first weekend after Vivian's arrest, he took Amara to the zoo, just as Emeka had once suggested, letting her ride the carousel twice in a row and buy as many snacks as she wanted. Her laughter came easily that day, and each giggle felt like a thread stitching shut the wounds left by months of fear. Rebuilding trust with his brother took humility. Chaik visited Emeka's home one Sunday afternoon, unannounced for the first time in years. Emeka opened the door with raised brows, then pulled him into a hug without hesitation. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. They spoke for hours, about family, about mistakes, about the blind spots love can create. Chioma, Emeka's wife, joined them, her manner warm despite the history. She told Chaik that the family had always worried, but hadn't known how to reach him, without pushing him further away. Chaik admitted he had been too proud, too convinced that defending his marriage meant defending his wife at all costs. Now, he knew the cost had been too high. The community, too, began to open its doors again. Neighbors who had long stayed away started greeting Amara at the gate, dropping off fruit or small gifts. The children in the estate invited her to join their games, and she slowly accepted, though she still clung to her father when strangers tried to hug her. Mom Nkechi remained a steady presence, her quiet care now visible and appreciated. Chaik raised her salary and gave her more authority in running the household, telling her, "You kept this home standing when I didn't see the cracks. I won't forget that." It was a time for mending, not rushed, not forced, but deliberate, like the careful tightening of knots that had once come loose. The divorce was finalized 3 months after Vivian's arrest. The court, unmoved by her lawyer's appeals, granted Chaik full custody of Amara. Vivian was found guilty of child neglect and abuse, sentenced to time in prison, and ordered to pay damages, though Chaik knew he'd likely never see a naira of it. What mattered to him was that she could no longer come near his daughter. The day the court ruling came through, he took Amara out for ice cream. As they sat at the small table by the window, she asked quietly, "Daddy, will she come back?" He met her gaze and said firmly, "No. You're safe now. Always." She nodded, seeming to accept it, then leaned against him as they shared the last spoonfuls of ice cream. Back at home, the changes were more than cosmetic. The curtains were drawn back wide every morning, the doors open to friends and family. Laughter returned, not the brittle performative kind, but the deep, warm sound that fills a space like sunlight. Chaik repainted the living room in a brighter shade, replaced the heavy furniture Vivian had insisted on with simpler, more comfortable pieces, and planted hibiscus along the walkway. Amara's room became her own little kingdom, decorated with her drawings, bright gardens, smiling suns, stick figure families, holding hands. None of the pictures showed bottles or angry faces anymore. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Chaik sat on the veranda with Amara, watching her sketch in a notebook. She drew 2 figures holding hands beneath a wide blue sky. "Who's that?" he asked, smiling. "Me and you," she replied without looking up. "And no one else?" She shook her head and grinned. "Just us. We're enough." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. Inside the house, Mom Nkechi hummed a tune as she prepared dinner, the smell of jollof rice drifting into the evening air. The home had been through fire, literal and figurative, but it stood stronger now, because its foundation had been reclaimed. And as Chaik looked out at the garden, he knew that the true wealth of his life was sitting right beside him, sketching a future free of fear. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.